Trump's view of the world is almost infantile. He talks in terms of settling a dispute in the schoolyard between two young boys. That's not what this is about. He's never demonstrated a real grasp of what is going on in eastern Ukraine and what has gone on in Ukraine and Russia, period, for the last, I would say, 100 years at least. It would be better if he understood the longer term implications of everything that's happened there. But the point is, certainly the last 100 years have gone right by Donald Trump without him understanding anything. And as a result, you get these stupid remarks about, well, he's bad and I don't like either of them and blah, blah, blah. Well, the truth is there's not a damn thing he can do about any of it. And threatening sanctions at this point, results in a big oh-hum from the Russians. What are you going to do to them? Remember, go back again to what Trump said, what President Putin said many months ago about the truth that there would be no change in the United States or Western Europe. The people in charge were going to continue to pursue sanctions, and so Russia has to chart a different path. The interesting thing is when Trump talks about the whole world, he might as well hang that one up, because with the exception of the West Europeans and some East European states, the whole world is on Russia's side. He doesn't seem to get that. He doesn't understand that the injustice of what the Ukrainians have done to their Russian citizens, to the Russian people in eastern Ukraine, and our attempt to turn Ukraine into this Trojan horse of destruction for use against Russia are things that everybody in the world understands except Donald Trump. Again, it's just discouraging. Now, there are a couple of things that Zelensky did say that are true. He's absolutely right in one thing. This war is going to end when he's gone and his inner circle are gone. That's when the war will end. And that's the message. There's no longer any room for discussion. They know what they're dealing with. Moscow understands what's in charge in Kiev. And this is going to end when he and his friends are gone. That's very clear. Secondly, I'm sure you're aware that there was an attempt to kill President Putin, attempt to assassinate him. The Ukrainians sent these drones in an attack mode against a helicopter carrying the Russian president to Kursk. Well, it failed, fortunately. But how did the Ukrainians know that this helicopter was going to leave when it did and was headed to Kursk? Well, I think the CIA and MI6 provided the Ukrainians with that information. This simply reinforces the view that President Trump is not in charge, because I think their view is if he were in charge, he would not have sanctioned an assassination attempt against the president of Russia. So all in all, the bottom line is we are now irrelevant to the outcome in Eastern Europe. And unless we and our allies in NATO want to declare war, mobilize our countries, and send millions of men and huge quantities of equipment east to fight in Russia, we should shut up, because it's not going to happen.
Yeah, let's hope that doesn't happen. But there seem to be some who do. You mentioned a minute ago that there are forces even within the administration and definitely within Washington that want to push Trump back into areas that are probably closer to what the Biden administration were doing. Well, one of those is Brother General Jack Keane, who went on Fox News earlier today and tried to press for both of those, trying to play on Trump's anger that he demonstrated to see if he could get him to go down this path.
In 2015 and 16, he did carpet bombing of Aleppo. He used chlorine bombs. He used cluster munitions that don't self-detonate like the United States does if they're on the ground for a period of time. He used deep penetration bombs to go into underground hospitals and kill the people. It was the largest carpet bombing air campaign ever conducted since World War II. This is who Putin really is. He targets civilians, and he's doing it here to put pressure on the president, because he knows the president wants to stop the killing, and he wants the president to get so frustrated he backs away. What should be done? The president almost answered. Crippling sanctions, to be sure, but also, listen, this is important because Putin pays attention to this actually more than he does with sanctions. He always thinks he can get around sanctions, and he has some evidence to prove it. And that is continued military assistance to Ukraine. That makes a difference on the battlefield. After all, we're 39 months into the war, and Putin isn't even close to taking control of Ukraine.
So there again, let's go back to the sanctions that never worked before. Let's try those again, and then let's reopen the spigots back up and let a bunch of weapons and ammunition go in there. But what do you say to that?
Well, setting aside the allegations against Putin, it's unworthy of serious comment. Keep in mind that the Russians did a lot of very serious damage to ISIS. There's no question about that. And at the time, we were very grateful for their help and assistance. Frankly, the Russians were able to do more damage than we were in most cases. And I don't recall anybody at the time bemoaning these actions against ISIS, which had proven to be a criminal organization committed to mass rape and murder wherever they could perpetrate it. Now, I know that they've been repurposed, and we now have one of their leaders, Mr. Jolani, in Syria that apparently is approved by Mr. Netanyahu and Israel, and therefore has the heartfelt support of President Trump. But I just grow tired of this sort of thing. I remember how photographs of supposed children or babies that had been killed or maimed or something in Syria were presented to Trump by McMaster, and I think at the time his daughter and Jared Kushner, to goad Trump into firing missiles into Syria. Well, this worked. They fired the missiles in, had no impact. And we now know, thanks to people in Britain and the United States that studied these events both times, we had these missiles striking, that it was all nonsense. None of what was, presented was true. It's so tiresome listening to this, but here's something that's more important. It's not just a question of sanctions, but he is singing the tune that Washington wants to hear. Washington is delusional. It thinks that it can act with impunity. The same thing is true for Mr. Merz in Berlin, Macron in Paris, and Starmer in London. They think they can threaten, and worse yet, they can take direct action through their proxy and kill Russians and get away with it. That's not going to be the case. And I think the populations know this in Europe. The populations don't support it. I don't see any evidence that anyone in the United States supports mass mobilization to go to war with Russia. So I think that's outrageous nonsense. It's not going to happen. But nevertheless, it's very dangerous because the Russians take all of this very seriously. And how could they not? They have to listen. They listen to the statements and they react appropriately. But the notion that continuing to do the same things we've done in the past is going to somehow or another magically work, well, we know that's the definition of insanity, as Albert Einstein taught. So that's not going to work. But it's dangerous nonetheless, because the Russians cannot afford to ignore these stupid statements. They can't dismiss them the way we can as ridiculous nonsense. That's what worries me most of all now.
And even for our own domestic situation, the idea that we can just turn the spigot back on and just like all of a sudden start flooding the zone with more weapons, ammunition, air defense missiles, etc., is belied by the fact that we are already at critically low levels of these things. And this exchange with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and a senator at a hearing last week addressed the very issue of how much stuff we have.
Is the president, and are you prepared to pass another supplemental bill to support them?
Well, that's a different decision. That's a different question. That's not up for me to decide. The White House would have to make a determination about whether to come to Congress for a supplemental. But everything that's been approved and congressionally appropriated is ongoing. In fact, to the extent that the Ukrainians have asked for anything additional, what they've asked for is air defenses, Patriot units, which frankly we don't have. But we are working closely with our NATO allies. There are NATO allies that do have some batteries of Patriot missiles that they could provide or transfer over to the Ukrainians to defend, for example, the airspace of Kyiv and other places. And we've been encouraging in that front and working alongside our partners there to get deliveries of some of these systems. As you can imagine, none of these countries want to give up their Patriot systems either.
Let me ask you a different question, Doug. You may recall it's probably about 6 or 7 months ago now. There was a headline in the West regarding the war and all the air defense that Ukraine was wanting at the time was that NATO force. I want to say it was General Bauer. I can't recall. I may be wrong on that, but I think it was him who said that, by the way, when you look at the air defense capacity for all of NATO, we have about 15% of what we need to defend ourselves in the event we were to ever get into a conflict with Russia. Well, now one would imagine that that's been treated down even lower. What does Russia take away from this when they hear this admission that we don't even have any Patriots to give? Western Europe might have some, but not that many. What does that tell them?
Well, they know because NATO has essentially published this statement, and I think it may have been the general you're referring to, that they're limited to point defense. In other words, the vast territory of NATO is largely open to attack. They can only defend specific points for a limited period of time. And again, you're firing 2 to 3 missiles against every incoming missile. So it doesn't take you very long before you run out. We know that particularly in the Mediterranean, if we are ultimately dragged into the war with Iran by Israel, we're going to run through our missile inventories there very quickly. I think there's a certain amount of bluff, a certain amount of arrogance that is rooted in ignorance. I think that's true for Senator Shaheen and her colleagues. Dan, we are on the edge of the cliff overlooking the financial abyss. We're headed into something much worse than 2008. We're headed into much worse than a serious deep recession. We're headed into something that could look like a depression. The $1 trillion defense budget is fantasy. It's never going to arrive. And I think there's an unwillingness to come to terms with this reality because people really don't think the debt matters. They think that we can spend recklessly in the future the way we have in the past. And the truth is we can't. And everyone needs to look at the bond market. The bond market is collapsing in Japan. It's going to collapse here. And once the 10-year reaches the 5% mark, you're staring at an absolutely unavoidable default. We simply cannot go on. You have the Fed that's trying to suppress interest rates. At the same time, you have the bond yields rising and the prices going down. And then you have the Chinese, the Japanese, and others, the Saudis, all of whom have our treasuries. It's not going to be easy for them to hold on to what is effectively worthless bonds in the face of collapse here in the United States. So I think it's a lot of nonsense, to be blunt with you. I think the Russians know enough about finance that they understand it's nonsense. But still, they have to take it seriously. They have to prepare accordingly. But I think we're looking at this financial collapse, and it's kind of running in parallel with the war in the Middle East and the stagnation of our effort in Ukraine. In other words, both things are on a parallel track. And the question is, which fails first, the economy or the overseas intervention in the Middle East and Eastern Europe? And of course, people talk about Asia. Well, that's a huge joke. You know, we can't possibly defend Taiwan, nor should we be involved in that business as it is. But the point is, all of this is fantasy now. None of it is based in fact. What General Keane was arguing for, we can take a stab at it, but it's not going to work. It's unsustainable. We are definitely going broke.